Hi, you're listening to AudioMag, Magazines Canada's podcast. I'm Evan Dixon, Director of Business Development at Magazines Canada, and I'm here today speaking with Tara Jacobs, Events Manager, Team Lead, and Stacy Bradshaw, Digital Project Manager from Annex Business Media, about planning and running virtual events, which have become increasingly prevalent in the wake of COVID-19. So to start things off, why don't you each tell us a little bit about Annex and your roles there? Why don't we start with you, Tara?
Thanks for having me today. So I lead a team of an events team here at Annex, and basically my role is organizing live in-person events in conjunction with our brand team.
My name is Stacy Bradshaw. I'm the project manager on the digital team at Annex Business Media. So I work with our very talented dev team and ad ops and email marketing teams to build out and maintain all of the digital properties for our 65 plus magazine brands.
Great. And what kinds of events do you organize for Annex?
So at Annex, we're B2B. So we do a variety of events from trade shows, conferences, galas, award shows, roundtables, you name it, we've got a version of it. And now virtual events have been added to that roster as well.
And you said you lead a team. How many people are on your team?
So we're a small but mighty team of 3. Each of us, though, is supported by our brand team. So at Annex, I would manage an event in conjunction with a brand team, which would include the editor, the sales manager, and the account coordinator. So we're also fortunate at Annex to have the support of our production and digital teams who help us with the branding and marketing of events. But as many event teams can probably relate, we are a small but mighty group.
Right. And how has moving to virtual events changed your team or the way you work with the other staff there?
It's been a definite transition. The way we manage live events is each one of us would take on a third of the live event portfolio. So we would manage the event from start to completion, execution. Right now, we find ourselves in a different position with virtual events. The roles have changed a bit. We started this spring not really knowing what was going to happen because of COVID. So we saw 50% of our spring events postponed. Our team had to undo and redo a lot of the work that we did to cancel venues or change venue dates. And then we had a quiet phase. And during this quiet phase is when Stacy and I worked together to create a virtual event product for Annex. But also during that time, the team had to rethink our roles and how we managed events. So the team has been very fluid. We've seen one of our team members who used to work with digital transition a little bit back into digital to provide more support there during our quiet time. But our roles have really shifted. And when we look at how virtual events run, at least at this time, the runway is pretty short. So instead of having one manager working on an event from start to finish, we've now taken the 3 of us and split up the roles. So myself, I'm managing kind of the front end in terms of getting the event launched, working on the website, making sure that we've got revenue targets in place. Another team member is working on the execution and the dry run of the event, the virtual event. And then the other team member is working on marketing and post-event reporting, which took up a lot more of our time than we anticipated. So having the 3 of us splitting our roles and changing them has allowed us to be agile and work together to pivot quickly in response to the changes that COVID-19 brought.
That sounds like a lot of rapid adaptation. Stacy, can you tell us a little bit about the technical side? How is that shift from your end?
Yeah, so we use that sort of ideation phase that Tara talked about to join a bunch of virtual events ourselves as attendees and really sort of get a sense of what we thought was working and wasn't working for us as individuals. And then we sort of aggregated all of the needs and wants from the different brand teams and try to sort of sift through that and decide how we wanted to actually technically execute these. And we landed on sort of a hybrid approach. A lot of the events that we attended were using GoToWebinar, Zoom, so sort of the leading best-in-class software when it comes to live broadcasts. So we thought that this was a time to be bold in terms of how we marketed events and how we communicated the value of these events to our sponsors and how we price these events, but it wasn't necessarily a time to take unnecessary risks in terms of diving into new technologies or committing to new partnerships with new tech vendors that we hadn't worked with before. So for those reasons, we stuck with GoToWebinar, which was a platform that we were quite familiar with. It was sort of right in our wheelhouse, and it had all the interactive elements that we need in terms of polling, chats, broadcasting video spots for our sponsors. And we have a strong team here that helps with webinar execution using that platform. So it's sort of second nature for us to just elevate that to a more sort of robust live event platform with multiple sponsors and transitions. And then when it came to the event website, we also have a very strong dev team, and WordPress is our CMS of choice. So we created custom post types specifically for the virtual event pages. So that allowed us to accommodate sponsor pages, agenda items, product demos, on-demand content. So those were the two pieces that we were sort of able to quickly sort out. The missing piece of the puzzle was, how do we use the GoToWebinar registration or say a Zoom registration, which we wanted to do because it works. The email reminders, the pre and post event follow-up, the reporting, it's all there. But we also wanted to turn around and make it so that we could deliver on-demand content and product demos, but behind a gate. We didn't want people to be able to access that sort of peripheral content that takes it from being just a webinar into a full event. We wanted them to be able to register for that as well, which allowed us to, create better lead gen for our sponsors and drive more registrations for the live event. So the question became, how do we connect those two things? So we worked with Omida, which is our CDP and audience development platform, along with our full stack developer, who created an API to sort of pull the registration data from GoToWebinar and into our CDP. So when people came to the website, they were recognized as registered to the event and allowed them to pass that gate. So like I said, we're using sort of proving technologies, but a hybrid approach where we've been able to connect the three.
That's really interesting. So it sounds like it's almost a combination of using tried and true methods that you're already very familiar with, but kind of boldly building a new infrastructure around them. Is that about right?
Exactly. Like we wanted, we had to go to market quickly. We knew that, but we wanted to do it in a way that we knew that we could execute with confidence. So, when I think of this project in my mind, the graph would look like an arch or a hill. And Tara and I spent so much time in that ideation phase, like it really felt like we were pushing a boulder up a hill, like we, with so many ideas, I think you could get really stuck in trying to find that silver bullet vendor or platform that you think is just going to kind of plug and play and work out of the box. And as we've all learned over the years, that often doesn't exist. And so our goal was to sort of get to the top of the hill, so to speak, and come up with a definitive plan so that we could say to our brand teams, this is what the framework looks like. Now let's make our content work within this framework. And as Tara can attest, once we got to that point where we decided definitively this is how we want to do it, then it was like the boulder ran down the hill. And we have, Tara, how many do we have in the pipeline right now?
We have over 40 now before the end of October.
Yeah, so in a very short amount of time, we've pulled together 40 events. So my advice, I guess, in that regard is not to get sort of stuck on that other side of the hill. Like you can talk yourself in circles trying to anticipate, what we think our audiences want. But ultimately, like Scott Jameson, our CEO, said it, perfection is the enemy of good. And that was the sort of mindset that Tara and I had. If these live events are canceled for the foreseeable future, we can't afford to wait for perfection. We can get darn close and continue to refine and improve it as we go. But our goal was to just get something, like I said, that we could confidently execute.
So wow, 40 events coming up, and I think a lot of magazine publishers would hear small but mighty, and that would sound very familiar to them. Do you have any advice on how to manage multiple events without burning out your staff?
Yeah, definitely. When we looked at live events, we had over 50 a year, so it felt similar to the situation we're in now with virtual events. And that's when Stacy said, we spent a lot of time looking at different platforms that are out there that offer some really fancy looking solutions on the outside. But the more that we dove into them, we started realizing they were pretty resource heavy, and that resource was going to come back to me. So as much as it might be nice to have a fancy sponsor booth, a virtual booth with an avatar, and you can engage in content by chatting with the customer or watching videos, we had to really dive deep and think about who's going to own populating that content and making this platform as robust as it is. And that we know our sponsors, we know working with them for live events often, it depends on the scale and the size of the company. Some just don't have the resources to have a marketing team that would be able to supply the content that we ask for quickly enough. So that was one of the factors when we were looking at switching to virtual and figuring out the platform, is how do we staff this and make sure that we're not taking on more than we can chew, knowing that we wanted to scale up and see most of our brands have a virtual event. So I guess over the past few years, some of the takeaways I could give advice to others would be looking at the tasks that your team has and prioritizing by chronology. And it's not rocket science, it's not something new, but often it can become overwhelming when you have multiple events over the course of months and everybody wants everything done today. So they all want their sell sheets, they all want their websites built, they all want to see what the marketing looks like, often before we even have speakers confirmed. So what I try to do is make sure my team prioritizes based on what's coming up next. So it's managing the tasks for events that are going to happen in July that are going to be a higher priority, and taking some time when you've got a breather to answer some of those questions for events that might be down the road in September or October. Just constantly reminding yourself you can't do it all in a day is really helpful. Another piece of advice I could give is to assign tasks based on your team's strengths and be willing to change. So when I looked at my team, we each were really good at executing our own live in-person events. But when we looked at the volume of virtual events that we were jumping on board with and the skills that you need to execute them in the time frame, it just wasn't feasible for me to be launching new events while wrapping up an event and marketing another event. These pieces were all happening at the same time. So be willing to re-examine your execution strategy to ensure that tasks are outside of your scope are not creeping in. That is something else that our team does often, is we have just a chat to say, how's it going? How's the stress level? Is everything manageable? And sometimes they say no, and it takes a little digging to find out why. And it might be that as a service provider, Stacy can probably attest to that too, people come to us to help them get things done when they don't have answers or they need support. And we're happy to do that, but sometimes we take on more than we can chew. So in my team, for example, they have strong digital backgrounds. Just because you can update a website, should you be? Over time, that creep can really add on to the stress for the team. The last piece of advice I have for dealing with small staff sizes is leveraging the resources and the systems that you already have in place. So at Annex, similar to many publishing companies, you do have a design team, you have a digital team, we have account coordinators who help put the pieces together for print and digital products. We really work with the systems that we have in place for accounting and invoicing and designing marketing for our events. We really leverage the resources that we have and the expertise of the people we have and apply it to our event strategy. So knowing it's not just the three of us, but there really is so much more behind the scenes that helps us execute, whether it's live, in person, or virtual events, really helps to prevent the team from burning out.
Thank you. That's great stuff. With so many events, I imagine you have something of a template. I'm wondering, Stacy, how much customization do you do for each event?
Yeah, so because we have so many brands, it's obviously prudent and for us to not reinvent the wheel for each event. So yes, it very much is a template that each brand follows. We say with sort of a reasonable amount of flexibility built in. We know there's not a one size fits all for every audience and for every market. So, product demos might be the perfect fit for certain industries that want to see new technologies or innovations in action, while other industries are more service orientated. So, in those markets, we didn't do product demos at all. And we replaced that section with, say, a virtual delegate bag that features offers or discounts or white paper, something sort of tangible that they can take away. So we put a lot of effort up front with our production team to develop strong branding for each event, and then let the specific industry needs sort of drive any further customizations. But for the most part, it's a very templated approach. And another thing I could mention too, just when Tara brought up the production team, we definitely had to aggregate our resources internally on these. It was very much, this was no longer exclusively for the digital team or the events team to manage themselves. It became a real team effort. And in a way that's such a positive thing. It sort of, broke down some of those silos that may have existed between the departments. And, that was a theme that came up quite a bit at the Magazines Canada Leadership Summit. So I was thinking about that in preparation for this podcast, that the pandemic sort of forced us to do things in a way that we didn't do before. And especially between audience, digital, and events, and of course, production, editorial, and sales.
And I'd like to dig in a little bit to the kind of distinctions between virtual event planning and live events. How do you approach planning differently for virtual compared to live, or is it that different?
They're really not that different. So when we look at launching an in-person event, we had a worksheet. It was an event launch worksheet that we shared and sat down with as a brand team. And that worksheet is now being applied to our virtual events. So whether the event is in person or online, an event should be launched to solve a problem. It should be a solution to a problem, a response to a challenge in the industry, or maybe a new opportunity. Some questions we ask are, is there a need in the marketplace for a solution right now? If there are competitors, other events in the market, what makes our event unique? Who is the primary audience? What is their buying power? And a big question is, how do we measure ROI for all stakeholders? So before we even go into launching an event, we want to make sure that we're doing it for the right reasons and that we see value not just for our sponsors, but for our audience and all stakeholders. So we work through those questions, and once we get through that, then we start talking about a content strategy specific to an event, and we make sure that the virtual event is the right product for sharing that information with our audience and sponsors.
And speaking of the audience, how do you approach finding your audience for a virtual event compared to live?
I can tell you it's been a lot easier. Oddly enough, there's less boundaries, which when you have a live event, it's situated in a certain physical space at a specific time on a specific date, and it requires resources and time and money for people to travel and get there and participate in the event. So with virtual events, we've seen those boundaries eliminated geographically for sure. Some of our events that we've had conferences in the GTA that have been very small, less than 50 people, we've now seen over 300 register online, and they're from Newfoundland all the way to BC. So it's a really exciting opportunity for us to engage all of our audience who typically might not have been able to make the trip out for an event. And there's financial barriers too with going to a physical event. A company might send the one person from their company. It might be the CEO. It might be somebody with buying power. But there's a lot of other roles in a company who could benefit from hearing the content and engaging with it. And we're seeing now more companies are signing up more of their staff, which I think is a great opportunity for them to also think about ways to innovate and engage with the content. We're seeing social and digital playing a bigger role in how we're marketing events, in part because the marketing window is shorter. So because you don't have to arrange for travel, getting to an event physically takes some time and logistics to plan. People are signing up the day before. They're signing up as the virtual event is happening. So social media is playing a big role. When we talk about barriers and silos, Stacy, that got me thinking about how social media has actually helped facilitate reducing those silos even within our company and our brand. With COVID-19, we've seen a lot of brands online on our social media platforms, and they're starting to share events more than I've ever seen before. So what's really neat is seeing all of our brands who, are in manufacturing, for example, they're taking the time to share other events that might have some relevancy to their audience. And it's neat to see how the pandemic has forced us to communicate a little bit better and to help promote to a broader audience.
It's really interesting how at a time when it seems like connecting with other people and with your industry should be more difficult than ever. Technology can actually enable much more immediate, easier connections. I find the way technology can mediate that experience really intriguing. Stacey, I wonder if you could speak to that a bit. What kind of opportunities have you seen from a tech perspective in terms of how a magazine can interact with an event's audience?
Yeah, I think when you combine technology with an authentic perspective and a voice and strong content, that's when real engagement happens. And that's why I think things like virtual events and podcasts are becoming so successful right now for magazine brands, because finally, that in magazine journalism, we've always talked about the voice. What's the voice of the magazine? And finally, we sort of can see that coming to life. You get to meet the editor and hear from the editor. You get to hear from the sponsors and the advertisers, and suddenly we're all sort of connecting in a more meaningful way. That being said, technology, when it doesn't work, can be super frustrating. So from a support standpoint, at least for us, we think about building in redundancies into our support infrastructure. So we have something as simple as a event support email address, and when people email that, it comes to myself and Tara and a few other people on our team, so that if it's in the middle of an event, something's going wrong, how you handle those situations, we know is more important than the fact that they happen in the first place. We have a backup person on each event. We do dry runs for each event as well in advance, so that we can all practice, make sure that the speakers have a good handle on the technology, make sure the webcams look good, make sure the audio is great. We do a lot of careful planning, sort of pre and post event, to make sure that the technology allows that voice to come through.
And once it's all done, you need to collect feedback, I would imagine, from your audience. How do you do that? How do you measure satisfaction? And is it different for a live event than virtual?
Because we're using a webinar platform, it has engagement metrics sort of built into the reporting. So we get a sense of how long people stayed on the event, their engagement level, like things like how long their browser was open, did they leave, did they come back, did they participate in polls, did they answer questions or ask questions, and that gives us a good sense of, like, the level of engagement is usually an indication that we've run a successful event. We certainly survey our audience after the event and get a sense of what they like and didn't like and what they'd like to see on the next event. And then we integrate that into our planning for the next event.
Yeah, and that's no different than with live events. At a live event, we've often issued surveys for feedback in paper or online digitally after the event. And what's been interesting to me is the engagement we've had and the feedback after a virtual event has been stronger. We've had more responses than I've ever seen before. So I'm finding virtual events are breaking the rules, so to speak, in terms of how people behave at live events. Typically, we have a hard time getting legitimate, good feedback, and people are taking the time to give us that quality feedback right after the event. So I'm not sure why, but we are seeing that behavior shift, and it's a positive one.
And how do you integrate that feedback into your planning process for the next time?
So we haven't actually looked at launching the next round of virtual events yet, but for live events, it plays a really big component. And so I can definitely see how we will be taking the feedback for these events and using it to plan our next round. But people, our audience, what they want is what we want to deliver and speak to. So we've been starting to see some feedback about timing, or there's been feedback about whether a break is too long or too short. We're going to take those pieces of information and build on that as we're building our virtual events that are to come. So we kind of establish some sort of internal benchmarks and best practices for how long should a break actually be. While we've seen 15 minutes is kind of the sweet spot, where 5 minutes or 10 minutes was too short. The same thing has come up about Q&A. When I've been at many of our live events, conferences, you sometimes get one or two questions. Sometimes there's none, and there's that awkward silence and everyone claps and you move on to coffee or the next session. We're finding that people are saying it was a great event, but we really wish we had more time for Q&A. I don't know if the technology is facilitating that more, and probably people are a little bit more anonymous, a little bit less hesitant to contribute. And so we're seeing a lot of questions coming in, so much that we can't get to them all. So we are thinking of how do we take this great content and keep the conversation going after an event. It might be great to use for an article after, or a way that we can connect our sponsors with our attendees after, if they had questions about specific technology that might have been referenced. So yeah, it definitely plays a big role in planning virtual or in-person events.
Interesting. And Magazines Canada, we're a big tent association. We have a lot of B2B members, but also a lot of B2C and cultural magazines. When it comes to engaging with readers and advertisers, what does the B2B sector do really well with events that consumer or cultural brands should steal?
This was a tough question, Evan. I'm not an expert in consumer or cultural by no means, but when I look at the three sectors, B2B, consumer, cultural, I think there's more similarities between them than we think. I think all of us doing events, we're appealing to emotion. B2B is sort of typically known for focusing on time and saving money and efficiencies and logic, and consumer is a bit more focused on emotional and in a purchasing that way. But I think when we do events, it's really, we're launching an event based on content, which is a foundation to make connections and facilitate transactions. And those transactions could be of any sort. So no matter the platform, whether it's print or digital events, podcasts, they're meant to solve a problem, to help answer questions, to make people's lives easier, to make you more profitable. And all of that does funnel down to emotion. Am I afraid of missing out? Am I afraid if I don't have this new product, my business might not be as profitable as the next business? So I think we're all kind of, oddly enough, doing the same thing with our events. And so long as you're keeping content as the foundation and really trying to speak to your audience and what's helpful for them and what they need, that you can't go wrong.
When it comes to the revenue side, sponsors and advertisers are a big part of events. So do you have any tips for approaching advertisers to sponsor virtual events as opposed to live? I know you're not necessarily in ad sales at Annex, but would you say that selling events is a bit different from selling, ads in a magazine?
Yes, it is 100% different. It is a completely different ask. And we have seen with virtual events, it's not as intuitive as you would think in selling a live event. So the ROI is going to be completely different. And we've had a lot of conversations with our sales team talking about what the value is to their sponsors for contributing. And there was this initial fear that we would be charging too much because somehow a digital virtual online event is perceived as being less valuable than a live event. Well, why? Because we can't connect in person. They can't network. Yes, they can. It's still different. It's a different way of networking. Is the content the same quality? Yes, it is. So we had to internally agree that virtual events are valuable, that we are still connecting buyers and sellers in a meaningful way. And once we established that platform, we looked at what benefits can we give if we can't give them live physical networking. So we didn't try to replicate, a networking cocktail event. We can't replicate going and getting a coffee together and having that organic conversation that sometimes comes out at a live in-person event. But what we can do is provide some really concrete ROI to our sponsors, more so than we ever can before. In fact, I'm looking at some of the post-event reports that we're putting together, and I'm frightened they'll never come back to live events. The value is so strong. So we're able to give our sponsors really good leads, understanding who's attending, but not just who's attending the virtual event. We can tell them of the 300 people who showed up today, these 10 people spent a lot of time on your sponsor page. So you might want to reach out to them because they're really hot, ready leads for you. So virtual events are taking that sales funnel and taking us further down the funnel than we've ever been able to before with live events. It's been a transition for our sales team to look at how they're selling this, but I think they've picked up quickly. We did a couple in-house go-to meetings with our sales team, and Stacy and I spent some time on a sponsorship builder, which is essentially a workable PDF that you can fill in, and it lists all the benefits of participating in a virtual event. From there, the sales member can work out a sponsorship program based on picking these benefits. They can pick and choose and put together a package that way. So it did take some upfront planning for Stacy and I to figure out what can we actually offer as a benefit, what would be valuable to a sponsor in terms of gating and leads and presence on the virtual event webpage. And then once we established that, it was making sure we took the time to educate our sales team so that they were confident with this new product that they were selling.
And do you view events as an important part of a magazine's revenue stream?
You bet. There's an old saying, don't put your eggs in one basket. Well, that's definitely never rang more true. I think when the pandemic hit, we had about 50 live in-person events, and that went to zero in a few short weeks. So our business is really based on providing quality content to our audience. How that content connects our audience and our advertisers is constantly changing and in flux. And because of this, it's more important now than ever to diversify your revenue stream based on the ability to maintain that steady cash flow. So you can never stop looking for opportunities. We moved quickly into virtual events in part because our audience still needs content and our advertisers still need to sell their products or services, but it was also another way to further diversify our revenue offering. So as we mentioned earlier, right now we do have 40 virtual events in our lineup, and it definitely won't replace the revenue that we budgeted for live in-person events, but it will certainly help. And I know our COO, Scott Jameson, will hopefully sleep a little better at night because of that.
Well, we all want Scott to sleep well at night. Yes, events a big revenue generator, even virtually. Last year, as you probably know, Pierre Marcoux took over 8 B2B brands from Transcontinental, and he founded Context Group, which he described as an event planning and media company. I find it very interesting that events come first in that description. We know they're revenue generators. Do you see a future where publishers might start to see themselves as event planners first and media companies second?
We're definitely seeing more publishing companies jumping into the event space. And when I started on with Annex Business Media about 9 years ago, it was just after the last recession. And I think that's what really spurred media companies to look at diversifying their revenue after we saw that happen. So events kind of took hold in the B2B space as a solid way to grow and diversify revenue. And now with COVID-19, we're seeing those same publishing companies launch into virtual event space to once again grow and diversify revenue. So if you take a step back and we look at what is it that B2B companies or media companies are doing, it all boils down again to content. So we are seeing, more publishers taking on events as a way to communicate with our audience. And I don't think it's going to stop there. I think we're going to see media companies continue to diversify how they reach out and connect to people. Podcasts, just like we're doing today, is another way that you can diversify your revenue and just offer more access to your audience to get that content.
And do you have any advice for people who are looking to start incorporating events into their B2B brand?
Yeah, if they haven't started doing live or virtual events, I would definitely start by looking at the team, the resources that you have, and try to set up a plan, a strategy that leverages the resources and the team that you have in-house. So there are a lot of fancy software platforms out there that will offer some pretty cool gadgets to help you launch an event, but they end up costing a lot of money and taking a lot of time. And from a live in-person event perspective, you really start out often with no budget. So the budget comes from your sponsors, the ability to get people on board to help support you. And events in person cost a lot of money for venues, hotels, food and beverage, AV. So if you're going to get started, leverage the resources and systems you have in place. Make sure that you don't invest a lot of time into executing live events until you have those sponsorship dollars in place, or that you're going to generate enough revenue through registration to make sure that you can cover the cost. And maybe now that virtual events are playing a bigger piece of the puzzle in the event space, it might be a good opportunity to test the waters in your industry for next to no cost. If you already have a webinar platform that you can use or Zoom, try doing a virtual event with your audience and see what the uptake is. And if you see that there's a strong response, it might be significant or it might be important to look at that as a good opportunity to launch a live event. I know we're doing that in some of our brands. We're launching virtual events in industries where we just couldn't take the risk financially. And it'll be a good test to see what the engagement is for little cost.
Right. And for folks who are looking into a virtual platform vendor, Stacy, what should they look out for?
Support would be the big factor. So how much support are they going to provide? And then in turn, how much time and resources are you going to have to invest into executing a solid attendee experience? So to Tara's point, like virtual networking lounges and booth space online might sound great in theory, but do you have the internal resources and more importantly, does your sponsor have the resources and the content to properly populate and manage that sort of virtual space? So some platforms, a platform with all the bells and whistles doesn't make up for a lack of good content. Again, to Tara's point, content has to be the foundation. I would consider things like caps on the number of attendees. So depending on your audience size, so the consumer market would have to consider that more so. Will it let you upload pre-recorded content? So we've had sponsors provide pre-recorded content that we deliver live during the virtual event. So consider that not all platforms will necessarily have that type of feature. And of course, the interactive tools, polling, Q&A, chat, survey, and feedback tools. In our case, a robust API was important because we connected it to the CDP. So, something that we could pull the registration data from programmatically. So not all SaaS solutions are going to offer that. I would ask the vendor how they handle tech issues. So if an attendee has a hard time logging on, is there a 1-800 number that they can call, or do you as a brand team have to provide that type of support? I would ask how it handles recording. So can you download the MP4 recording after for editing? We do that here quite a bit. Or is the recording stored in an account, and how long is it stored there? All of these things, all of these features sort of contribute to the overall reliability of the platform. So, which is perhaps the most important feature, really. So I would use it. I would sign up for a free trial, attend an event on the platform if you can, ask other publishers that have used it, because if it's not reliable, then the rest doesn't matter.
That's good stuff. Thank you. And we're starting to see a gradual easing of restrictions to social gathering. There will be a day at some point when we can gather again. What do you have in mind for when that happens? Do you see yourself going back to mainly live events, or maybe a mix of virtual and in person?
Yeah, I definitely think that after all this is over, we will go to a hybrid strategy. There are some brands that the virtual event platform is working better for than a live event. And there are some events, especially in our ag industry, where you just need to get together in person, out in a field with your tractors and looking at dirt. That's never going to be replaced. The opportunity for people to connect in person will never be replaced with a virtual event. And yet, virtual events are breaking down barriers and giving access to content and opportunity that people otherwise didn't have before. So I think virtual events are here to stay, definitely within our industry. We are not looking at doing any live in-person events for the rest of 2020. So looking ahead to 2021 before we start planning on physically getting together again, and hopefully I'll have enough store of hand sanitizer to be good to go. But until then, we're going to focus on our virtual event game and hopefully come back with a strong hybrid when we can get together in the future.
And do you see potentially hybrid approach within a single event, like a live event with a web stream, or would you expect it to be more kind of one or the other?
We haven't really determined that strategy yet, but we have talked about it internally for some brands that are planning their events for February next year. We decided that it would be easier to choose one. So pick a platform that's going to work the best for most of your audience, and go with it. There is an opportunity that you could do a recording of a live event and offer that as a live feed. And we dove into doing live broadcasts of our events in the past with not the best response. And it's a lot of extra cost to manage a virtual event with a live event with all the hard costs. So I think we're going to see more events popping up where the opportunity, the budget hasn't been there before, but there'll still be, I don't think that we'll see too many combinations of doing a live and a virtual event within the same brand.
Thanks. That's very interesting. We're just about coming to the end of our conversation, so it's plug time. Where can people find out more about Annex and any upcoming events?
You bet. So people can visit our corporate website, which is annexbusinessmedia.com. On this website, you will find a tab at the top that says brands, and that will take you to the webpage for all 65 plus of our brands. So from those brand pages is where you can find information about our virtual events. And if anyone has any questions, they can always reach out to me. We've got an events tab on our corporate site as well with my contact information.
Well, thank you so much, Tara and Stacy, for speaking with me today about taking events online in the wake of COVID-19. This has been a really great conversation. I've learned a lot, and you've given us a lot to think about.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
So listeners, please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review AudioMag on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Follow Magazines Canada on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Mags Canada, and on LinkedIn as Magazines Canada for more magazine news and resources. Thanks for listening, and thank you again to Tara and Stacy for joining us. AudioMag is a Magazines Canada podcast produced by Messenger Bag Media. We recognize the funding of the Canadian Department of Heritage through the Canada Periodical Fund.